Thanks, Tanya, for the introduction. Again, my name is Curtis. I'm a climatologist here at the Drought Mitigation Center and one of the US Drought Monitor authors. My background is in meteorology, so I'm still learning the climate side of things a little bit. But yeah, I'll go ahead and, as Tanya said, we're going to go through kind of what the Drought Monitor is, how the Drought Monitor process works, what a Drought Monitor week typically looks like from the point of view of the Drought Monitor author, to try to give you all some insight into what that looks like. This is a version of a presentation I gave recently at a meeting in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I'll try to go through this somewhat slowly. I don't know exactly how this is going to time out. We budgeted about a half hour for that. It may go faster, but again, if that's the case, that'll leave more time for questions. So I'll go ahead and get started here. I find the right button on my keyboard. There we go. Okay. All right, so kind of three main overarching topics that we're going to go over today. First, just looking at the US Drought Monitor map, we're going to talk about what's on it, and then statistically speaking, what it means, and then how it's made. So, and we'll kind of go through aspects of each of those individually. And again, as Tanya said, please feel free to pop into the chat box with questions. I already see something. So drought, the way we're defining it, is a deficit of expected water availability that results in water shortages for some activity or group. So what does that mean? So when we say expected water availability, that means that we're looking at not just input precipitation, but aspects of the entire water cycle. And any drought should have some sort of impact too. And so the reason that we care about those water availability shortages is because that's going to be impacting some activity group, some sector of the economy. So again, all drought's going to have a location or an area and is going to be defined with respect to what is normal for that area. There's also an aspect of drought that's going to have to do with the time of year or season in which it's occurring, since often precipitation has a seasonal component to it. Water loss from evaporation, transpiration, snow melt, any of those other parts of the hydrological cycle. Again, this varies by location, but it's usually seasonal as well. And again, any of these water shortages in different parts of the hydrologic cycle are going to have some sort of impact on people and society as a whole. So, and we want to know what those are usually. So the Drought Monitor map, we're trying to capture multiple perspectives on drought that's occurring. So you can define meteorological drought simply as kind of a water balance, as in how much water is coming in and then what's being lost. Usually we'll look at things like precipitation deficits to define meteorological drought. But then you have drought in other sectors, for instance, agricultural drought. That kind of includes some of the impacts that you guys would see drought have in an area on agriculture, usually as a result of hot temperatures taking away soil moisture, which then has an impact, a negative impact on trying to grow different types of crops. Oftentimes, as drought lasts longer and longer, the impacts become longer term and are seen more in hydrology. So oftentimes we'll see deficits in reservoirs and deficits in deeper groundwater. And so those obviously can have impacts on water availability for drinking water, lots of other things such as hydroelectric power generation. And then on different time scales, you also see drought affect the ecology of an area. So there will be impacts to local plants and animals that you can see. So as an example of this, if you look at what's gone on with like the wildfires in different areas, that can be a long-term effect of drought. So drought can make trees more susceptible to burning, for instance. So, and then socioeconomic drought, that kind of combines several of these different things into what impact does drought have on society and the economy in different sectors. So again, the US Drought Monitor map, we're not trying to look at any one of these individually. To the extent that it's possible, we're trying to look at all of them at once with one map, which obviously is a little bit difficult to do. So we'll get into what some of those challenges look like here. So the Drought Monitor is intended, and unfortunately this map here is a little bit old. I forgot to put the new one in here today, so I apologize for that. We can look at the current map later on the web if you guys want to, but this is the map from June 7th, so roughly a month ago. And so the US Drought Monitor map is effectively showing three different things. First, the spatial extent of drought, so you can just see that in the area that's covered by the different colors on the map. Second, the intensity of the drought. And so intensity is determined by what color you see on the map. So the darker, the redder colors indicate more intense drought, or by definition, as we'll go through in a minute, more unusually dry conditions relative to the climatology of a certain area. And then finally, we're also trying to look at the relative length of a drought and the type of impacts it has. And so with those things, you're going to see the S's and the L's on the map. As you see, I think you guys might be able to see my cursor here. So this S with the pointers towards the different Hawaiian islands, that's indicating short-term drought on those different islands, which then basically indicates drought impacts that we tend to see on a 6-month or smaller time scale. SL indicates that we're seeing both short and long-term impacts, whereas an L, such as this area encased in western Oklahoma into the eastern Texas panhandle, is mostly, in the opinion of the person doing the map, more strictly long-term drought, where the short-term might be neutral or perhaps even wet. So as alluded to earlier, the Drought Monitor map is based on more than just the incoming precipitation in the form of rain and snow. So that's one of the things that we're looking at, but we're also trying to look at how much of that moisture goes into replenishing soil moisture and groundwater relative to what's normal for an area, what the vegetation health looks like based on satellite products such as NDVI and derived products from that, such as veg-dry, and then the effect that incoming precipitation, evaporation, and other factors have on variables such as stream flow in creeks, streams, and rivers, lakes and reservoir levels. And we'll also look at the impact, the side of the hydrology, different hydrology equations in terms of how much atmospheric thirst there is, or how much water we think is being lost to the air relative to what's normal for a location. So we have some in situ data to measure some of these different things, but we don't have that in all areas. So we also use a lot of remotely sensed products. And so again, in addition to these different aspects of drought and different aspects of the hydrologic cycle, we're also looking at multiple time scales. So for variables like precipitation, we tend to look at data from roughly several weeks, usually a month, out to sometimes as long as 2 years, occasionally even longer if it's relevant to the impacts that are occurring. We also have combined products such as SPEI or something like veg-dry that I alluded to. And those are going to take both short and long-term types of data and create a derived product from those. And we'll get into what some of that looks like in a moment here. So again, as we discussed, we'll look really anywhere from, this says a week, but usually several weeks out to sometimes multi-year periods. And again, we have different intensity levels denoted by colors on the map. So the white and yellow areas are not by definition drought. Those are no drought categories that either means neutral or wet conditions. We don't show the wet side of things on the map. or abnormal dryness, which is our kind of precursor or post-drought category. It shows areas that may be entering into or coming out of drought. And then we have names for the other progressive drought categories, the D1, 2, 3, and 4, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with: moderate, severe, extreme, or exceptional drought. And then again, as we looked at the maps earlier, the lines and labels on here denote different drought impacts based on, or expected drought impacts based on the length of time that an area is experiencing drought conditions on. So again, I just have these different labels circled here for you guys to see what that looks like. So then another thing that you'll find on our website, then if you go to droughtmonitor.unl.edu, we'll have the map up at the top, as you can see here, and the name of the author for each section of the map. There are two sections of the map right now, a page 1 and a page 2. Page 1 is the continental United States, including Hawaii and Puerto Rico. And then our page 2 section, which is somewhat new, includes the United States Virgin Islands and the US affiliated Pacific possessions. That's the American Samoa, Micronesia, the Mariana Islands, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. And so each of these have a narrative associated with them. So each week, the author of the map will write, and again, this varies slightly by person, how they prefer to write this, but the general idea of this narrative is to at least give brief explanations of what changes were made, why they were made, what weather conditions led to them, sometimes a brief overview of the types of impacts that are being reported in different areas, and connecting that back to what changes occurred on the map that week. Usually this will have, and this varies person to person, but often this will have a bit of just like a brief weather overview over the last week too. And then there's also an Outlook section, which is more or less a communication of the National Weather Service Weather Prediction Center's 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 day outlooks, and then the CPC's 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks. Okay, so we've kind of gone through what's on the map, where to find the different things on our website. So we'll get into a bit more of the nuts and bolts of what the information actually means, what specifically is being communicated by the different colors and labels on the map. So this is a time series over the last roughly century of annual precipitation amounts from Mesa Verde National Park in Southwest Colorado. And so I want to briefly suspend what we talked about earlier with all the different data inputs that we look at for the Drought Monitor map. And just for the sake of discussion, imagine that the Drought Monitor, just in theory, were only based on yearly precipitation. So let's say we're looking at a historical record and we wanted to assign a Drought Monitor level to each year in this period of record at Mesa Verde. So what we would want to do, and this is, and just to demonstrate the statistics of how the overall Drought Monitor process works, we're going to identify the most extreme events in the period of record. So 1941 and 1957, for instance, you saw over 30 inches of rain both of those years. 2020, just a few years ago, was the lowest amount of rainfall and snowfall ever recorded at Mesa Verde, just under 8 inches. And so we've identified, this is about 100 years period of record, we've identified the 5 lowest levels of rainfall here. So 2020 and 1950 being the 2 lowest, followed by 1956, 2012, and 1934. And so what that means then is the reason we've color coded these this way, and you have your crimson, or your my alma mater Sooner red, and then Husker red, and the red category here for 34, 56, and 2012 is those would be your exceptional and extreme drought years, because you have the first and second driest years in 1950 and 2020, and then the third through fifth driest years after that would fall at the extreme drought. This means that we're using a percentile-based approach to apply categories. So go ahead and click through a few more of these here so you can see those percentiles come through. So imagine then if we charted these having 100 years of ranked data, your drought monitor values, your yearly drought monitor values then would be your exceptional drought years, again, would be 2020 and 1950, because that's the first and second percentile. 1934, 2012, and 56 would be your extreme drought years, because that would then fall into the third through fifth percentile. Your severe drought would be the 6th to 10th ranked years that you can see here. Your 10th through 20th percentile would be your moderate drought years here, and the 20th through 30th percentile would be your abnormally dry years. So when we're doing the actual map, then we're trying to show this same strategy for identifying how unusually dry areas are. But again, that was a really simplified example. All we were looking at there was annual precipitation. Here, we're actually looking at all the different variables for hydrology, stream flow, input precipitation, snowpack. And rather than just yearly precipitation, we're looking at all those variables over multiple time scales that we talked about earlier. But we're using otherwise the same strategy of trying to look at the percentiles of those different inputs based on their historical records. And then from a convergence of evidence approach, basically, what is the majority or at least the plurality of data associated with those different data inputs show for an area, we then adjust the lines accordingly. So we're more or less contouring around percentiles of different inputs, but often those will give different answers. So then how do we actually accomplish doing a task like that? So first, it's a participatory process and a collaborative process. So the map is a collaboration between the National Drought Mitigation Center here at UNL, the US Department of Agriculture, and NOAA. And so we have authors, basically a single person who's responsible for the map each week. This week, it was my coworker, Brian Fuchs, here at NDMC. And so each of these different authors then will be responsible each week for moving the lines around. And so you can see just geographically where the different people doing this are located. So what the process looks like, this is just a bit of an overview here. So the author is going to take in all of the objective data into GIS software. And so this will all be geographic data that can be mapped. And these different data types, whether they be rasters, or basic grids, or in situ point data, is all going to be placed into percentiles and then overlaid on a map so that the author can click on and off different layers. Then we'll take impact reports from people. So these impact reports don't by themselves change the map, but they can help us kind of understand what impacts are going on in different geographic areas. And from that, then we can kind of take a critical eye to the data. And like if, for instance, if I hear that there are agricultural issues with crops going on, I might be more apt to make sure that I overlay our veg dry product or ESI or EDI when I'm looking in a specific area, because I kind of have an idea what's going on in the ground from those impact reports. So then each week on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday morning, the author will send out drafts of the map to a gigantic email list of local experts and other Drought Monitor authors. And so then those people will review those drafts and send us feedback, usually in the forms of comments, suggestions, criticisms. And then we'll take that and iterate on drafts until Wednesday afternoon when we have one that everyone's happy with. And so again, that process then means that we're getting feedback from local experts. I live in Lincoln right now. I grew up in St. Louis and went to school in Norman, Oklahoma. So I am most familiar with the climate and weather in the central part of the country. So I, as a drought monitor author, am not an expert with Western weather or Eastern weather, or at least the intricacies of the hydrologic cycle in those areas. So it's very helpful for me to hear from people who know what's going on in the ground, know their local climate better than I do. So then the final map is released on Thursday. That's finalized Wednesday afternoon. So usually the drought monitor author will set a cutoff time for, hey, get your recommendations for this week into me by X time. Usually that's sometime early in the afternoon on Wednesday. So, and then the map is released Thursday morning. Once it's released, it's finalized. It cannot be changed until the following week. So, and before that, any drafts of the map are under wraps, so they cannot be shared publicly. So to give you a quick idea of the type of input data that we're looking at and the sheer amount of data that the drought monitor authors are looking at, I'm just going to pop up some of the sample data that we have here. So this is a 7-day radar and weather station based precipitation layer from the AHAPS products. Stream flow data, and again, if you'll notice down here on the right, we plot most of this data with percentiles so that we can overlay that with the drought monitor categories and have an informed idea on how to move the lines around accordingly. So SPI, that's a statistic that helps to describe the amount of precipitation over a period of time with respect to location's own local climate history. So I'll just quickly run through these. It's a product called Vegetation Health Index. Again, this is expressed in terms of percentiles. EDI. And this GRACE product is another satellite-based product based on percent, and we plot it with percentiles. And so, yeah, this can be a bit stressful at times because overall, there can be as many as 150 different data layers that we can look at if you look at everything for a location. So when I'm actually editing the map, I have a zoom in over the St. Louis area here. This might be something what it looks like. So this yellow and tan line here represent D0 and D1, or abnormally dry and moderate drought areas. I have different mapped vertices that I can then drag around. So usually I'll have several products open in the background. On this one, it looked like I had 7-day radar rainfall estimates, and then the large circles being stream flow percentiles, probably at averaged over 7 days. And then the dots here were, looks like 2-month SPI, so weather station based rainfall statistics. So you can plot more stuff at the time if you want. It can get a bit messy. So usually when I'm doing the map, I'll click on and off stuff to, again, look at drought from different perspectives and align the map with the percentiles accordingly. So, and just a quick overview of the people who helped with this process. So this is from a couple years ago, one of our more this recent regional breakdowns of who's on our email list, what places we hear most often from. And again, we send out different drafts to the email list, and then we'll iterate on those. So this is an example of some of the chatter that my coworker Deborah Bathke had with the, it looks like a map from 2021 here. So this is, again, an example of, she sent a draft, and then Laura Edwards from South Dakota sent back some information on what she thought of the draft, what changes she thought should be made after the draft that Deb sent out, and some reasoning for those changes. So again, it's a collaborative process. So this can get a little bit hectic with all the different types of data we're looking at. I personally like to keep track of information on a bulletin board where I go state by state and make sure that I note what states I've already addressed, which ones I need to hear from. I'll print out all the emails that I get to keep track of those. And it gets a bit hectic by Wednesday afternoon. Usually this is actually pretty tame compared to what my desk usually looks like by midday on Wednesday. So if people want to submit impact information, as we discussed before, you can do this through our drought impacts toolkit. Most of the time we'll want to direct people to our See More drought reporting tool. You can find that. I'll go ahead and put this in the link. It's going to be go.unl.edu/CMOR, CMOR. I'll send that out to everyone here. And so again, we use this information to kind of zero in on different areas. Ultimately, the data, the input physical data is what has to drive the depiction on the map, but the impacts are helpful for context. And they're potentially most helpful for helping people at a state level to contextualize what they're seeing on the ground. So oftentimes, state climatologists, whoever is providing state level input from that week, will compile impact information for us and then kind of give that to us in a prepackaged way. So convergence of evidence, we kind of mentioned this earlier, where we're trying to align percentiles of these different statistics to the categories on the map. So what that looks like, we have physical data layers at multiple timescales. We're getting interpretation of those timescales both on our own, the person doing the map, the author, and then we're getting feedback from local experts to help us contextualize that data. As an example, a map that I did, I think about a month ago, I was seeing really low stream flow values in northern Colorado up in the Rocky Mountains. And so I thought, based on what I was looking at, hey, this area is seeing low stream flow. I might need to, if the other data supports it, make degradations on the map, move the lines around to show worse drought. And so then someone in the Colorado group let me know, hey, the reason that stream flow values are this low is actually not because of dryness, but we've had very cold weather and a lot of snowfall over the last couple weeks, and that hasn't melted yet. Usually by this time of year, we're seeing more snow melt, but it hadn't occurred yet because of how unusually cold the weather was. So that was something that, because I didn't know the local climate very well and hadn't had time to, because of some travel, I hadn't had time to pay attention to the intricacies of their local weather over the past couple of weeks. I didn't know that. So again, we're getting interpretation of these different data sets from local experts. And then the drought impacts that are being reported helps us do the same thing. And so from kind of all these different things, then we have our convergence of evidence, where we find the percentile level that basically best describes what's going on. And then we align the map values to that. So the final map is released on Thursday mornings. It's always valid at 8 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And again, once the map is released, that's what it's valid as of. It cannot be changed until the following week. So while the map is released on Thursday morning, the data that is valid for, and I'm sorry that just ran through that, the data time that we're considering cuts off at 6 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time on Tuesday, or 8 a.m. Eastern Time, meaning that any data that I'm going to consider for a map released on Thursday, the 26th of whatever month this is, I'm only considering input, precipitation, and other data sets through 8 a.m. on Tuesday, the 24th. That gives us time to evaluate the data basically and move the lines around, because it's basically impossible to continually analyze that data through Wednesday afternoon if we're constantly considering new data. So already beyond just the Wednesday evening into Thursday morning, there's already a 48-hour lag built into the product between when the data cutoff is for what we're considering and when the map itself is released. And then it's also a weekly product. So in order to maintain continuity from week to week, the Drought Monitor authors will then send an email to the other authors, particularly the next person doing the map, to let them know kind of what they had during their week, what areas were most difficult to analyze, what we think we may have missed that maybe the next person should take a closer look at. If I get emails from people, say, disagreeing with what the map shows in a certain area, critical, if I see those emails or get those phone calls on Thursday or Friday, I'll compile all that information and keep track of it on the map while I'm doing that for information for the next person doing the map. We often do it on 2-week segments to basically help us maintain week-to-week continuity. But sometimes our schedules get crazy enough with personal travel, work travel, that we'll do 1-week stints. So that's been more common recently. So this is a fun picture of pile of papers that I had from Drought Monitor shift right before I went on a hike in Kansas and typed up the transition email that evening. So again, we're trying to maintain week-to-week continuity with each other and communicate such that things don't fall through the cracks from week to week. So we'd like to be able to share this information through things such as the webinars and workshops that we're doing right now. The Drought Mitigation Center, we have different brochures and tutorials that you can look at and share with people. We also frequently do media interviews when requested. So again, we'd like to do education and outreach for this product. And we're always ears to take questions. So, and this is how you can reach us. Deb Bathke, one of my coworkers, who's also an author here. Here's her email address. Here's mine. And then Brian Fuchs, the other current US Drought Monitor author here. This is his contact information. So with that, I will take any questions. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Curtis. If anybody has any questions, if you want to put those in the chat box, that would be great. Or if you want to unmute and ask Curtis a question, that's fine too. Thank you, Mark. Any questions at all? You might get off the hook today, Curtis, without having to answer any questions. I'm trying to think of one to get the ball rolling.
I'm willing to hang around as long as people want to discuss or think of things. So, or you can email me later if you think of something now too.
True.
James, you asked, could you go over weighting? Can you briefly explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I just probably easier to talk here than type it all out, but going over weighting in terms of you have all of these inputs, you have a multitude of information. Mm-hmm. Is it like a homogeneous weighting scheme where, you know, rainfall is weighted at this across the country, or like you were talking about in Colorado, do you weight more highly stream data flow there as opposed to somewhere else?
Right. No, that's a good question. I figured that's where you're going. I just wanted to be sure. Yeah, so I wouldn't say that it's a homogeneous weighting scheme. So a few things. First, we have different experimental, or at least kind of quasi-experimental products we're working right now that attempt to use some machine learning to do weighting schemes with our different drought inputs that'll try to depict short and long-term blends, and we're working on right now a flash drought blend too. We usually use those more to draw the impact lines, not necessarily assign categories on the map. So in terms of the weighting on the map, it's not a homogeneous thing. Oftentimes, as I alluded to earlier in the talk, you can see a nice convergence of evidence in some areas where multiple timescales and multiple different types of inputs are all going to align at or around the same percentile. Often that doesn't happen. So insofar as it's a human being drawing it, it is a bit subjective insofar as we have the ability to critically analyze the data. So it's hard for me to say that there's kind of a hard and fast approach to, we always weight X, Y, and Z in these ways. It's often going to be people on a local level kind of helping us do that. Sometimes it's going to be a majority of the data show this range of percentiles. Sometimes only a plurality will show that. And then again, as you mentioned, sometimes you'll have one or two inputs that show something, but then based on the local context, we know, hey, that doesn't mean what just the immediately apparent way of interpreting it means what it means, like in the stream flow in Colorado example. So yeah, there isn't a homogeneous weighting scale per se. It's what does the majority or plurality of data show, but with some wiggle room to critically analyze the data based on what local inputs are saying, what impacts are showing us. So that's the best way I can think of to describe that. So does that make some sense?
It does. It answered my question. And I look forward to seeing the outputs from that machine learning experiment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.